Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Business Models and Monetising Digital Work. My name is Laura and it's a pleasure to be with you today for this very timely session. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of countries around Australia, including where you are today. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation and I pay my deep respects to elders past, present and future. If you would like, you can please share an acknowledgement of the country you're on today with us in the chat. Currently on screen, there is a purple PowerPoint holding slide with text and video boxes with our guest speaker and Auslan interpreter. I am a woman in my mid-30s, I'm fair-skinned, blue eyes and dark brown hair. Today I'm wearing a blue shirt and coming to you from my makeshift home office. Welcome to Creative Connections. In a minute, I will introduce you to our excellent guest speaker and host for today's session, Peter Tullin, to talk about a topic that is critical to so many of us at this time. This webinar series has been developed to support you during this time of intense change and unprecedented challenges. Now, more than ever, our sector needs to come together, support each other, and think differently about how we might cope and adapt to this new world we find ourselves in. These regular sessions will hopefully provide you with the resources and support to tackle some of these challenges and sharing these experiences together. Please share these sessions with anyone you think might be interested, and all of our past sessions are published on our website. Before we start with Peter, I would like to quickly go through some of the features and housekeeping notes for today's session. Firstly, live captioning is available. If it's not already on your screen, you can turn it on by pressing the CC button in the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also click this button to pull up the full transcript if you prefer. We will be running a chat throughout today's session, and we encourage you to share any ideas, thoughts, resources with each other throughout the session. Due to Zoom security settings, you can't copy and paste or hyperlink from the chat, but we will share any resources with you at the end of the session. You can access the chat by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. We'll also be having a Q&A session with Peter at the end of today's webinar. Ian will be looking after this, and if you have a question for Peter, you can add it to the Q&A box again at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do our best to get in touch with everybody, but if we run out of time, you can also send us an email at leadershipprogram@australiacouncil.gov.au. Finally, we will be recording the session and this session will be available on our website in the next few days. If you are having any tech issues throughout the session, you can raise your hand again at the bottom of the screen and Francis from our team will be in touch with you to sort it out. Just before we start, I wanted to share a couple of opportunities and resources that we have available for you at Council. Firstly, I want to talk about Futureform, which is actually very timely today's session. Futureform is a professional development program for organisations to rethink and reimagine, transform their business models. As a participant, you'll join other organisations from around Australia in a 6-month program to explore, ideate and evolve your business models under the expert facilitation and guidance of mentors and coaches. Applications are now open and they close on the 26th of June. We've also launched a podcast series this week and we've got Amrit, the Director of International Development, to talk to you about this. Hi Amrit, are you with us?
Hi Laura, thank you for having me. My name's Amrit, I'm the Director of International Development at the Australia Council for the Arts. And this week we released the first episode in our Intel podcast series, which profiles innovative approaches to international engagement. The podcast, called The Future Is Now, profiles the collaboration between Sydney's Performance Space and Austin's Fusebox Festival. After 3 years of planning and collaboration, looking to a program of exchange and presentation for Australian and Asia Pacific artists at Fusebox, their plans had to change quite dramatically because of COVID-19. So in this podcast, we talked to Jeff Kahn and Ron Berry, and they talk about how a month out they changed track and shifted the collaboration to Fusebox Festival Virtual Edition. This virtual festival goes live tomorrow. It runs from the 24th to the 26th of April. You can find details at fuseboxfestival.com and performancespace.com.au. And you can listen to this podcast and view the transcript via the Australia Council's SoundCloud page, and we'll share the link to this in the webinar notes later. Also look out for more Intel podcasts coming up over the next few months. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks so much, Amrit. And yeah, listen to the first episode. Highly recommend. It was excellent. All right, so it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our guest for today. Currently on screen is a PowerPoint slide to introduce our speaker. There is text and an image of a man wearing a suit shot in front of a painted background. Peter Tullin is the co-founder and managing director of Remix and culturelabel.com. Remix is an organisation that tackles the big ideas shaping the future of the cultural and creative industries. Remix Summits are a conference of sorts that brings together leaders from across industries to share ideas around technology, entrepreneurship, culture, and creativity. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend you have a look at the Remix website, and I'm sure Peter will talk to you more about this today, but there's heaps of great resources on there. Now more than ever, our sector is thinking about their business models and reimagining new, different and innovative ways to operate and sustain online during these unprecedented times. While it's still fresh and painful for many of us, there's also an opportunity for creativity and exploration of digital platforms. Peter will provide an overview of these platforms today and think about different ways we might approach monetizing our digital work. It is an opportunity to think about how we might adapt our practice and our organisations to these platforms. Thanks so much, Peter. I'm going to hand over to you now, and I think you've got some slides.
Thank you, Laura. So yeah, I'll just begin by sharing my screen quickly. Hopefully you can see those. I'll just move into the slideshow. Great, so there should be some slides on stage. Welcome everybody. I just want to join Laura by also paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm here from Geelong, from Wadawurrung country. It's really, really exciting that 1,000 of you have signed up. So yeah, looking forward to the next 40 minutes or so. First thing to say is I've done my best to barricade my office door, but there is a chance Jack and Rory, my sort of 3- and 5-year-old boys, might try and find their way in. So hopefully I won't have some co-presenters like that sort of BBC excerpt, but I'll sort of plow on regardless. I'm also joined virtually by Simon Cronshaw, who's my colleague over in the UK, and really keen that all of you sort of ask questions, share your insights, and he's co-developed this presentation with me, so he's going to try and respond to some of those in the chats, and obviously we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. So to begin with, I think it's always helpful just to know where people are coming from and the lens that I apply to this particular topic. And I think Kevin and the team asked me because I guess I've spent a bit of time in the trenches in this space. So one of the things that I did was to found culturelabel.com, which back in 2009 was one of the first websites to sell art online, which sounds like a very obvious thing now, but it wasn't something people were really doing back then. And I guess the key thing for me there is we went from 0 audience, 0 revenue, you know, giving up jobs and, you know, raising money, building a team and a product to the point where we had, you know, 250,000 people a month going onto that site, you know, buying art and design products from, you know, hundreds of museums and artists from around the globe. So it's not easy, but you can do this stuff. And that got me very passionate about the whole subject of creative entrepreneurship and new business models and changes that are happening in the cultural space because of, you know, new audience trends, new technology trends. And so we set up something called Remix Summits, which is I've been running about 5 or 6 years now. I know people are tuning in from all over the world, so we do them in places like London, New York, Sydney, and other places. But perhaps more relevant now is, knowing I only had sort of 40 minutes, the other thing I wanted to kind of flag up is something called Remix Academy, which we launched this week, which is 500 talks from some pretty amazing people that we've had at Remix over the years. But there's also about 10 hours of free webinars that we've put together around things like digital business models, experience economy, etc., that go into this stuff in a lot more detail. So I'll do my best to give you a whistle-stop tour, but you can browse that at your leisure. Just go to the Remix website or remix.academy. And one of the things I will do today is I'll share, we're pretty privileged that some of the speakers have included incredible digital luminaries like, the Chief Creative Officer at Facebook, or people from Twitter, LinkedIn, Google, as well as amazing pioneers in the cultural sector that are doing stuff in this space. So I will shamelessly try to sort of share their insights with you, throughout the talk. And then the final thing we do is we try and apply a lot of that theory, those trends, in practice. So we work with a lot of cultural organizations. We've developed the strategy and vision for something called Acme X, which was the first co-working space in a museum in Australia. We've recently been working with the amazing team at the State Library Victoria on their redevelopment, and developed something called Start Space, which is a hub for early stage entrepreneurs, whether they're social entrepreneurs or creative entrepreneurs. So we do a lot of stuff in this space. So moving into the kind of subject at hand, digital's not easy. It was interesting. Tandy and her talk on Wednesday shared a poll, and a lot of people are still quite early in this space. So I'm trying not to assume too much knowledge. And obviously everybody's thinking digital at the moment because we're in this, incredibly challenging and difficult situation. So there's not a huge amount of optimism at the moment, and we're just responding to circumstances that we found ourselves in, which are pretty heartbreaking. But I do believe digital should be more central to our thinking, full stop, not just for the next sort of 2-3 months or however long lockdown lasts. And I think what's really clear, and you'll see from some of the examples, that there's a big connection between online and offline. They're really kind of blurring now. And some of the best examples are where people have driven audiences through online activity and then obviously monetize those, use that horrible word, in the physical space. And obviously, you need to be thinking about how those two things fit together. I'll talk about lots of models and people that are doing really well in this space. But for most people, it's not going to be the sort of panacea to all of your problems. It will be an element of the money that you make within a wider funding mix. Some people are fortunate enough to make this stuff their day job. For others, it's part of an overall income mix. It's never going to entirely replace things like public funding, for example. But I think you should be thinking about it medium to long term anyway. Some of the research that we're seeing already coming out around COVID-19 shows that we're going to need to think about this more anyway. So, if you look at things like research in the US around sporting events, there's talk that 72% of audiences won't feel comfortable coming out until there is a vaccine. Another 13% want social distancing in place before they'd consider it. Now, these things will change as people adapt and get used to the situation. So the figures won't stay exactly the same, but certainly we're not looking at a short-term situation here. So I'll also talk about the odd big example. I don't apologize for that, because the idea is I think the principles are applicable, whatever scale that you're working. It's about the model and about the quality of the idea. But please, like I say, as I move into the talk, share your own ideas and your insights. There's lots of people experimenting in this space. There'll be incredible knowledge and insights within the 1,000 or so people that are watching. So, and share your failures as well, because nobody's a complete expert in this space. A lot of this is also about adopting things like that sort of startup approach of lean methodology, doing things quickly and on little resources. And where you fail, that's okay. They're things that you learn from, and as long as you fail fast and move on, that can be a really good thing. So yeah, there's a little bit of context. I want to start by getting people to understand that the sort of the digital business model it's got to be part of your bigger thinking. And given we've got plenty of time on our hands, there's 2 books that I'd really recommend. One's by Simon Sinek, which is called Start With Why, and another one's called The Curve by Nicholas Lovell. And to start with Sinek, really what his theory is about getting people to understand why they exist, and everything begins from there. Because what you've got to find is the people who believe what you believe. And actually a lot of people really struggle to understand why they do what they do. They can say what they do, but in a world of mission creep where we do kind of lots of stuff, and maybe not the right things that we do, and we can sort of say how we do it, although we might not fully understand what makes us special. But you always start with kind of why. And I'll talk about that in the context of some digital business models now, because that's really, really important. You need to understand why you're doing something, because then obviously that will influence how you're doing it and what you're doing it. And that may significantly change, actually, if you really understand your reason for being, because all of this is about building audiences and getting people to align with your view of the world. So an example of this, and a big shift in a digital business model, is time out. So if you look to the left of the screen, where there's a graph that shows, basically on the right-hand side of the graph in red, this talks about the numbers of users. So this is large numbers of people on the right-hand side of the graph. And on the left-hand side of the graph, this is engagement. So often this means a lot less users, but these are the very engaged people. And what Nicholas Lovell talks about is you actually need to think about free and low cost and things that you can provide, because that's what basically builds your curve, will build your audience. And when you have that audience, what you need to really find is the super fans, because what they will give you is your kind of high value transaction that will make you the money. So a great example of this is Time Out. So Time Out, like a lot of media organizations, have never had more followers, people that are looking at their content, both through their free online content, social, website, mobile, through their app. Their magazine's now free. So they have 242 million people a month that come into contact with Time Out in some way. But also, like a lot of media organizations, never have they made less money. But they've got this big funnel, this big audience that's coming in. And actually what they discovered about 3 or 4 years ago was where actually they were going to make their money was actually offline. So it's this connection between kind of online and offline. And their team in Portugal applied to attend it, and they developed the Time Out market. And the Time Out market is a curated physical space where they bring together the best of emerging and established restaurants, bars, cultural activity in Lisbon in Portugal. And in the space of 2 or 3 years, it's become the #1 tourist attraction in Portugal, 3.6 million visitors. But that one market produces 18% of all of Time Out's revenue. So what does that mean in terms of what Simon Sinek's saying and purpose? Is that what Time Out realized is they are experts at helping people enjoy their city. You know, they've got this knowledge, this expertise that they share in this space. And therefore, when they really understood that was their unique selling point, that was their purpose, that was why they existed, they then developed a series of models that took an audience that actually had a free transaction with them into a paying one. Another example of this is Kickstarter. And it's a slightly old example, but I think it really illustrates the point about superfans and their value. And this is the story of Double Fine Adventure, which later became a game called Broken Age. And Tim Schafer is somebody in the computer games world, and he's famous in the sort of 80s and 90s for making iconic games like Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle, these point-and-click adventures. And basically, Tim had a problem, and this problem actually led to the growth of Kickstarter as a platform. And his problem was basically he would take his ideas to publishers, and they said, well, look, we've now discovered sort of shooting people, so we're not really interested in what you do. But he believed there was an audience that was still there for these adventure games. So he decided to launch a Kickstarter campaign. And he sought to raise $400,000, but he got $3.3 million. So it was the first big campaign on Kickstarter that really brought it to sort of public prominence. And the story of that campaign was analysed by Nicholas Lovell in his book called The Curve. And it's fascinating because it shows the value of actually free or low-cost content and how that creates superfans. So there were 90,000 backers. And the lowest tier you could buy was a digital copy of the game, and that was $15. And actually, that was the largest number of people. So over 50% of the customers bought the $15 tier. That gave the campaign traction, it gave it reach because they shared it. but they're not the most important of the curve in terms of finance. So the over 50% that bought the digital download of the game only provided 20% of the revenue. But 14% of the backers, a much lower number, backed at the $100 tier. So that was a physical copy of the game and a physical copy of a documentary they made around the Kickstarter process and creating the game. But they provided 33% of the revenue, even though it was a much lower number of people. And then if you take all the way along the curve of people spending $100 more, right up to 4 people who spent $10,000 on having lunch with Tim, who looks like an interesting guy, so you can stay there, is discussing his game with one of the Muppets. I'm not sure I'd pay $10,000, but hey, some people did. People who spent $100 or more were responsible for over 50% of the revenue. And had he have had a single pricing point and said, look, it's just $15, that's the price, that campaign would only have made 40% of its total versus this idea of variable pricing where you're catering to the superfans. And music's a great example of an industry that's really suffered because of single pricing, charging $10 for something when they might pay $100. And you could probably say the same thing about a lot of cultural organizations. Why do we sell one-size-fits-all memberships when the internet gives us this incredible data and analytical tools to find these superfans? And then the final example I'll give, which is much smaller, which is about an individual, is somebody called Tilly Walnes. And Tilly is the creator of Tilly and the Buttons. And Tilly's a great example of somebody who's not a digital native. She was a manager at the independent cinema office in the UK. But her passion, her hobby at the time, was she wanted to basically get people inspired about making their own clothes. So this is a kind of craft example. So she was somebody who did sewing and designed patterns. And her hobby, basically, she started blogging about. And her insight was she wanted to translate into plain English the kind of old sketch diagrams that people used to do into her commentary, colour photos, sewing tips, and encouragement, all aimed at millennials who basically hadn't really been taught to sew. That wasn't, it was a younger generation that didn't do that. They found it off-putting, they didn't understand it. So she produced this blog to get people into sewing. And over a period of time, it became really popular because she had a particular voice. Like I say, she wasn't digitally trained, she wasn't a digital native. She designed learning programs at the independent cinema office, so she put that insight to good use. But this blog suddenly, over a period of time, had 24 million viewers. It was extraordinary. And because what she did was very visual and she was sharing her patterns, over a period of time, she got 500,000 followers on Pinterest and 120,000 on Instagram. And that got her noticed as somebody who was doing something new in this craft and sewing space. So she got eventually onto the Great British Sewing Bee. She wrote a book that became a kind of bestseller. But all of her initial stuff she was giving away for free. But what she realized is actually she's part of this curve. She has these users that are engaged, this community that she's built, and then they come onto her site. And what she does is she sells them digital sewing patterns. She now does online training on her website. So she's got a series of products that are high value, but also because they're on her website, they're quite high margin. She designs a pattern and then sells that digitally, only for £6.50 or to £14.50 as a maximum, where they're buying a sort of physical version of it. Most of that money is going to her. So she now employs a small team. She works with other makers who feature within her online training. So she's created a platform where also she can share the money that she generates with other creatives. So I think there are two interesting models, and a lot of the questions to Tanya about what's that connection between free and pay. So that could be one of the answers. The other thing you might want to think about is some of the business models. Again, I don't want to assume too much knowledge, but the next slide looks at 6 different business models that I'll just quickly talk you through. So one is free. So this is, the classic model used by people like Google and Facebook. We consume their content for free, but it's basically paid for by other people through advertising. And there are some examples, and you can go and check these out, and I'll talk about 1 or 2 as I go through the presentation, but this is a slide you can go back to because there's lots of examples in the cultural space of people doing this. So one is the Dots, which is a kind of LinkedIn for creatives in the UK, which has about 300,000 creatives that use it. and creatives join for free and use the platform, and then brands pay to connect with those creatives because they want to hire the talent or work with those creatives in a variety of different ways. Then you have things like freemium. So freemium is where you get a certain amount of free access, classic examples being Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube. But that free access might be limited, say, by the amount of time you can use it or the depth of engagement. You might only get access to a certain type of content. It might be limited, such as LinkedIn might only allow you to have a certain number of searches. Or there might be some barriers to enjoying it fully, like advertising. But if you pay a subscription, you pay them a bit more, then you can access, the full content. And examples of that in the cultural sector, things like Smartify, which is an app it's the world's most downloaded museum app. You can go into galleries, you can use your phone, and it will recognize an image in the gallery, and it gives you information around it. It's free to use, but they'll have things like in-app purchases. Or even things like a podcast might be an example of that. The podcaster, like Memory Palace here, gives the content away for free, but they monetize it through you going to a live event, for example, and paying a ticket price there. Then another model is what we call subscriptions, so probably best popularized by Netflix. But if you look at things like the BFI Player, the British Film Institute, they have a subscription streaming platform where you can basically access their content each month. There are some models now that are trying to be, for example, a Netflix for culture, like Marquee TV, that takes lots of cultural content from different organisations, puts it in the same place around the performing arts, or digital theatre that does that for theatrical organisations, or Broadway HD that does it for musicals. And then you have e-commerce or the marketplace model. Obviously, Amazon's probably a really well-known example of that. But there are now a plethora of websites that allow you to sell art online, or music, or craft, or individuals that are selling through their own websites. So I'll talk about some of those later. Then there's a share economy. So this is the idea, again, probably popularized most by people like Airbnb or WeWork. So Airbnb obviously allowing people to rent other people's apartments or houses, or WeWork that allows you to do that with offices. In our space, I mentioned things like Acme X, a project that we worked on with Acme, where you can go into a co-working space in the same way. And then the final area that I'll talk a bit more in depth about is donation. So this is things like Kickstarter, Patreon, or GoFundMe that does it for individuals. But there are a whole number of businesses that are using donations, creative businesses, as a key part of their business model. So starting with donations, Kickstarters is a good place to start. So the first thing, this is an area you should definitely get involved in. So, Kickstarter alone is now close to $7-8 billion that's been donated. Huge amount of money that's come through that area. And it's growing at close to 20% a year. So this is a big and growing market. It's one of the best tools out there if you want to really align with an audience, because it's great market research. It's a great way to build audiences and to find out whether your ideas are going to get traction. And obviously what's fantastic about Kickstarter is about getting a creative product out in the world where you don't have the resources to do it. So you're building an audience to do that. About a third of backers repeat pledge. So if you find a model that works, you can build a lot of audience in through the platform. The success rate's about 38%, so it's not necessarily a slam dunk. And there are some big projects like the one I talked about before, but the average is about $15,000. So, they're not necessarily huge amounts of money. Another option, I'll talk about some specific examples in a moment, but another option is Indiegogo. The reason I mention that one, it's smaller than Kickstarter. So about $2.5 billion raised so far from their figures in 2019, but they have flexible funding. So whereas Kickstarter, you only get the money if you're successful with the campaign, Indiegogo has something called flexible funding, which means that you can keep what you get, and you may have to modify, obviously, the product or what you do if you don't get all of the money, or you may use it to find money from elsewhere, but you don't lose the money if you don't raise the 100% target. And then also wanted to mention Possible, because that's an Australian example, and it specifically focuses really around creative products as well. And about 76 million has been raised on that platform so far. There are also other options like the Australian Cultural Fund as well. All of those platforms charge about 5% of the money, and there's normally payment transaction fees as well. But what's more important is how people are using it. And I think a great example is mini museums. So Hans Spex, which you can see in the image there in the middle of the slide. Hans is a sort of eclectic collector type person, and he took that sort of hobby, that interest that he'd grown up with, and he decided, why can't anybody have their own museum? And he was the curator. He brought together a series of interesting objects that range from a piece of, as you can see from the image here, Steve Jobs' turtleneck to a piece of foil from the command module in Apollo 11. And this has been really, really successful. It turns out lots of people want to collect and have their own mini museum. So he's raised over $6 million to date from over 16,000 backers across 5 editions. And I mentioned the repeat pledges, so people come back and back to do this. His prices range from $199 to $450. It's limited edition, so obviously there's an incentive to buy it, or it might run out. Another one is an artist in the UK called Stuart Semple. Stuart's got an interesting story in that he had got into a bit of an online dispute with the well-known artist Anish Kapoor, because Anish Kapoor had bought the rights to a black paint called Vanta Black. And if you're not into your paints, Vanta Black is the blackest or darkest color in the world, supposedly, absorbing 99.96% of light that hits it. But Anish had bought the rights and had decided that only he was going to use it. And this had annoyed Stuart Semple and a group of other artists, who said, why should you keep this amazing thing to yourself? So he started developing his own paint. So originally he did a black paint, and then he developed sort of black 2.0. By the time he got to black 3.0, he felt like he'd perfected the new blackest black in the world. So he decided to put that out to a Kickstarter campaign with this group of artists and other people that had become part of this campaign. And the result was extraordinary. He had over 10,000 people back to this campaign, raising over 900,000. But there was a condition. If you bought the paint as one of a series of rewards on the campaign, you had to guarantee that you would not share it or give it to either Anish Kapoor or anybody associated with Anish Kapoor. I'm now going to move on to Patreon. So Patreon is something which has grown hugely in the last few years, and it's somewhere between reward and philanthropy. So as you see with Kickstarter, a lot of it's not just about pure donations. People are buying into your creative product, but they want something in the return for helping make that happen. And Patreon is a bit about saying, yes, I probably want something, because obviously, again, I believe in your creative product, or they believe in the creator, but they're also wanting to just give that creator money so they can go out and explore their ideas and to do things. And I think that's also finding its way into business more generally. So The Guardian's a great example. The Guardian, as you're probably aware if you read its content, and I pledge to The Guardian, is a bit like Time Out, never been more read, never had it made less money. And basically they said, well, look, we believe in, we're providing fearless, independent journalism at a time when the world really needs it. And if you believe in that, the traditional business model for media doesn't stack up, you need to help us to do that. So they put out the call for people to become regular donors or to do one-off donations. And now 650,000 people regularly donate to The Guardian. And last year, for the first time in over 20 years, The Guardian made a profit. So The Guardian is a great example of a brand or an organization that people believe in, can get passionate about, and has made donations a key part of its business model really successfully. And I think the arts can do that in a similar way. And the joy of something like Patreon is Patreon's about recurring donations. So it's not that one-off thing. Every month, it might be small amounts, but somebody contributes to your creative product. And what the internet is fantastic at doing, and Patreon's a great example of that, is connecting fans and creators to fund content development that may not happen any other way. So I'll come back to Patreon in terms of podcasting, but it's had a huge growth in terms of the amount of money that's now being donated. So they've had $1 billion, this year. paid out to creators since 2013. And so there's significant money going through it. Again, it's small pledges, as I said, about $12 is the average pledge. The number of active patrons, though, is now 4 million people. The number of creators is over 100,000. And in 2019 alone, patrons said they're expecting to give out over $500 million. The biggest categories are YouTube creators, which is really where it sort of grew from. Podcasters are number 2, illustrators are number 3, and then authors are number 4. But it's authors that are using techniques like giving out a chapter at a time in return for that backing. Again, they charge about 5% as a basic level, plus the payment processing. Payment processing tends to be about 2 to 3% typically for most platforms. But if you pay slightly more, so as you start to get more patrons, you can take advantage of other benefits. So the ability to sell merchandise, give your followers special offers, for example. And people that have used those higher platforms have found really good results. So special offers, giving benefits such as access to unique content, has seen some patrons increase their earnings by as much as 288%. So moving on now to individual donations. This is a big growth area. This is individuals raising money for charities, but also individuals, including creators, raising money for their work. And the big player in this space is Facebook, increasingly. You may have seen Facebook fundraisers when you've been on Facebook. It came out of the Ice Bucket Challenge, you might remember a few years ago. It's a horrible word, particularly moment, virality, that sort of spread all around the world, where people were raising money through the Ice Bucket Challenge, but Facebook realized that it didn't have a mechanism on its platform to collect that money. So they set up something which were personal fundraisers, where you can raise money for a personal cause, including that could be your creative activity, or you can raise money for not-for-profits. In the first 3 years of Facebook fundraisers, they raised $1 billion, so a pretty large amount of money. But the second billion took less than a year. So it's growing really, really quickly. Just under half the people who give said they've been inspired by social media to do that. So obviously it's something that commands a lot of our attention. So not surprisingly, this is driving a lot of new users. If you're a not-for-profit, obviously you can set up to have a fundraiser on Facebook, but where a lot of the money is coming from is getting individuals and using their networks to raise money for those not-for-profits. So I could set up a fundraiser and then connect that to a not-for-profit of my choice. For individuals, Facebook charges a 5% fee. Non-profits actually get 100%, so it's pretty good there. Now, the final area in terms of individuals would be GoFundMe. Again, this has become a really big platform for individuals to use. So they've raised $9 billion from 120 million donors. And this is very much about small amounts of money adding up to a lot. It's a particularly successful platform because it doesn't charge fees to people that are using it to fundraise. They rely on actually the donors to give to GoFundMe as well through virtual tips. But a lot of artists, creative organizations are starting to use this platform as well. So on screen, you can see an example for the Actors and Entertainers Benevolent Fund, where they've raised nearly 70,000 in relation to COVID-19. And on the platform, Australia is actually the third most generous in terms of donations per capita. So, a generous country in terms of online giving. Then a really new area in terms of new adventures with your crowd is crowd equity. Now, I wanted to mention this one because, as I mentioned with things like crowdfunding, a lot of it's about getting reward. And actually, a number of platforms realize that actually people might want to get more involved than just giving a donation in order to buy a product. They would be prepared to invest their money to help grow that organization as a small shareholder. And to give them the money to really sort of take things to the next level. And the classic example of this was a craft brewery in the UK called Brewdog. They had the best line ever for crowd equity, where they said, look, you probably sat in a bar and wished you were a shareholder in a brewery. Now you can be. And they raised $50 million from 50 small investors, and they're now the #1 craft beer in the UK. Now, this is starting to translate into the cultural and the creative sector. So, for example, Possible.com that I mentioned earlier have launched something called Virtual.com. Now, Australian platform, they have 610,000 members between Possible and Virtual, now their crowd equity platform. And some of the early projects were not to do with culture. So, for example, I mean, amazing projects like Seabin, which has raised nearly 2 million now from 1,800 investors. That is a product that takes rubbish out of the oceans. Or Sheba, which is a ride-sharing service for women, driven by women, hopes to give them a much fairer deal than platforms like Uber. That broke the crowd equity record, raising 3 million, but now it's starting to be used for culture. So Gigged In is a great example here. Gigged In is an app that allows people to experience live music. You basically pay a monthly subscription, you get credits, you can use those credits to access gigs, and the idea is 50% of gigs in Australia go unsold, so they want to help artists, promoters, venues, fill those venues. Obviously hard in COVID-19, but it's a digital platform that allows them to do that, and they raised over 400,000. So podcasts very quickly now, as I move to the final few examples. Podcasts, there's a load of stats on the left. You can ignore them because the key ones are as follows. So these are US stats, but basically over 50% of the US populations now listen to a podcast. 32% listen monthly. That's a huge growth from 10% about a decade ago. Weekly podcaster listeners consume about 6.5 hours of content, so they're very dedicated. It's a really good age spread. Pretty much every age group is listening to podcasts. A lot of competition now, 550,000 active podcasts, but the growth means there's more and more ad revenue. Now, it's still not easy to make loads of money, but there are some creators that are doing a great job in this area. One is Honor Eastley. Honor's spoken at our events, and she's set up something called the Starving Artist podcast, so obviously worth checking out at this particular time. She found a need that isn't necessarily obvious in terms of creating the very biggest podcast, but suddenly by putting this out there and finding an audience and presenting it in a format that worked for people, she actually made it into the top 10 of iTunes in Australia within what's now Apple Podcasts. She debuted at #1 within the art category, but the podcast alone wasn't enough to basically support her as a creative. So she's got a Patreon account. She's got 36 patrons. That provides a certain amount of money, but she also uses things like sponsorship. So she managed to get some sponsorship from Etsy, which obviously has lots of creators on its platform. So very obvious, link. She's also uses public funding. So she's had funding from people like Creative Victoria, for example. She built a profile and a platform in this space, but then that allowed her to get more conventional broadcast deals. So she's worked with the ABC on a podcast, and one of her other passions is she suffered from mental health. So she's really interested in ways that podcasting can support people, who are trying to deal with some of those issues. So she set up something called the Big Feels Club as a related entity. And I worked with Honor because she was part of a accelerator for the creative industries that Remix worked on with the State Library and ACME, funded by Creative Victoria. And that's a patron-driven subscription model. So Big Feels has 155 patrons. It generates about 2,000 Australian dollars a month. Again, not enough to live on in itself, but it's part of a bigger kind of funding mix. The other example I'd give is Nate DeMeo. Nate produces a beautiful podcast called The Memory Palace. The Memory Palace is part of the Radiotopia network. He basically does very short form historical stories, and there's a lot of history podcasts out there. He's a writer and he's an author, and he realized he's not a historian, he's not even a history buff, but he reckons that history was just about great storytelling. So he does these 8-10 minute short stories about objects, moments in time that have become very popular for people to consume in short bites. And a lot of his money, he's become big enough now that he gets money from Radiotopia as a podcast network. So he gets a share of advertising, their membership subscriptions, their donations, but he also monetizes through live events. So I'm going to move now on to live streaming because, sorry, to video, because this has become a big area. Why is it important? 82% of all traffic is predicted to be video by 2022. 69% prefer video to text. Only 20% of people apparently finished reading online articles, which is terrifying. Partly this is because we've only now apparently got an online attention span of 8 seconds and it's dropping. So video is a good way of engaging people quickly. Facebook and YouTube, the obvious leaders in this space. What's good for us in the creative sector is 43% are watching performances, conferences, that type of activity. 97% of consumers are happy to share video and great content. So it's great for growing reach. And then when you get into areas like live streaming, this has 6 times the engagement of conventional video. So I'll talk about live streaming in a moment as well. So creators of this generation, storytellers, they can tell product stories, in particular for brands, and this is about the money bit, in a way that no one else can. Their audience really trusts them, and they look to them for advice around the newest products, services, brands, etc. So to make money on YouTube, there are some barriers. You need to have 4,000 watch hours, 1,000 subscribers in the last 365 days. And they make money in a few different ways to demystify the YouTube star. One is ads. It's worth saying not all ads are born equal. So if an ad is showing during your video, you get a cut of it. But if your content is highly relevant to a particular advertiser that's prepared to pay more, you can actually make money with less subscribers than somebody with more subscribers. Oops, sorry, I'm just going to turn off my timer because I'm going to have to finish in a moment. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, so you can basically make money from your advertising. You can do what's called placing affiliate links. So if you're talking about particular products somewhere in your video, you can put a link on there, and when somebody clicks on it and buys it from Amazon or wherever it is, you will actually get a clip of that. You can sell merchandise on your page. So YouTube has partnerships with people like Teespring who produce products on demand. So you can put your creative imagery on a product, on a t-shirt, whatever it might be. And when one of those is sold off your page, you get a cut of that money. You can promote brands. So you can do that directly yourself. So if you're working in the case of, say, Honor with somebody like Etsy, you could talk about Etsy and they might pay you directly for that. But YouTube has a marketplace called FameBit, where brands that are interested in accessing, people on YouTube and getting them to promote their products, put basically opportunities on that marketplace, and you can pitch for it as a YouTube creator. And YouTube takes 10% commission on that. And if you are part of, as you probably know now, is you can subscribe to YouTube and pay a premium, and then you don't see adverts. Basically, what that means is you will also get a cut of the subscription fee paid for anybody who watches your videos. And you can also now start to create your own YouTube memberships for your subscribers. So a bit like Patreon, you can basically say, right, for X amount a month, you can basically access exclusive content on my site, and you can give your members things like badges, emojis, which they can use to interact with you on the YouTube platform. And YouTube's also finally, as a 7th area, is introduced something called YouTube Giving, which is similar to Facebook and what they're doing in this space. Now, I'm aware that I'm starting to run out of time, so I want to leave a bit of time for questions. I haven't quite made it through all of my slides, but as I say, I go into all of this stuff in a lot more detail on the Remix Academy site anyway, so there's free webinars. So maybe this might be a good place to stop for any questions that people have. Or I can keep going, Laura, your call.
No, I think that's great. Thanks so much, Peter. And there's so much content in there, and wow, so useful to get some insight into all of those platforms. So yeah, I recommend heading to the Academy site if there's more on there. We have had some questions come through in the Q&A, and if you've got a question for Peter, can you add it into the Q&A box? We might start with this question from Shep, which is actually a question we hear quite a bit. And he asks, with so much free content online at the moment, how do we now compete?
Yeah, so but this is probably the million-dollar question in terms of making money from content, and I think that the curve shows that giving stuff away doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing if you've got a strategy about where you're going to make money from that audience. And look, and a lot of it's about the added value you can provide to those people that can become super fans of what you do. So, you know, I would argue, if you take somebody like Honor and the Starving Artist podcast, had she not have had a very successful free product, would she have built an audience that she could then go to ask to be, you know, patron donors? You know, so I think there are sort of, and a lot of platforms have this inbuilt. So if you look at, I was going to talk a little bit about online learning later. So a lot of the platforms like, you know, Coursera, for example, you take the university world, provide free content. But if you want the extra tuition, if you want the credentials, then you need to pay for that. But by providing free content, that platform builds a really big audience. And obviously this is inbuilt into a platform, you know, like YouTube. And I think what you again, you're consuming the content for free. People build subscribers, and then they can do offline things like live shows, or they can do these deals with brands. But it's quite a complicated mix. And I think it is obviously complicated by the fact that lots of people are just giving stuff away. You know, we obviously have a lot of cultural organizations that are funded by public funding, and they're giving their stuff away online in the same way as they would give it away offline, because that's the particular model that they work to. Where I think some of the real innovation in this space is happening is with individuals. And often what's exciting is where those two things can come together. So if you look at influencers, a great example is, if you know the Field Museum in Chicago, they were pretty smart in that they have signed up as their first ever chief curiosity correspondent, a YouTuber called Emily Grazili, and she has a really great, podcast, YouTube channel, which has got about 500,000 subscribers. And they realized that actually she was the right voice, she was the right messenger to get across what they were doing. So the Field YouTube presence now comes in two ways. So there's Emily's channel, which has the Field Museum branding on there, but it's actually quite minor relative to, you know, her particular kind of podcast. And then there's the Field Museum's own YouTube channel. And I mentioned, like, Emily has like 500,000 plus subscribers. The Field Museum has 3,500 subscribers. So she's the one that actually is driving the traffic and the interest in what they're doing. But they've been smart enough to say, well, actually, you're an influencer. How do we team up and do that together? So she's building their audience. And I mentioned Nate from Memory Palace. So Nate was recently the artist in residence at the Met Museum. So he went in and basically spent a year there. For him, it was an amazing playground where he got to play with the Met's content and develop new content, which obviously was creating new audiences for the Met. So I would say, as long as you're building an audience, you can find creative ways of monetizing it. And for those individual creatives, it's an interesting space to be in, but you've just got to be prepared to probably look at 5 different ways that you make your money. And very few of these people are overnight successes. That's the other thing. You know, you've got to learn your craft. It's not easy. Culture label, again, in my experience, wasn't an overnight success. And you need to be strategic. Like, where does the free bit fit in with everything else? Because if you're just doing free for free's sake, then you'll build an audience, and that's fine if you just want to get eyeballs. And also think about online and offline. The money you might make, obviously hard at the moment, might be in the offline space. Like Secret Cinema is the best example of that. You know, Secret Cinema build these immersive worlds where people go and experience the world of the movie in this interactive and immersive way. Secret Cinema, again, were tiny back in the day, if you go back 10 years ago, but they had this brand and idea that was built to leverage social media. Secret Cinema, tell no one. And of course, people would go into these amazing worlds that they built, and the first thing they would do is tell everybody through social media, I've just seen this incredible recreation of the universe of Blade Runner. And suddenly they had 250,000 social followers. And now audiences for their shows will rival the number of people that will go to something like Glastonbury. And that audience is highly, highly engaged. So they can then take it online. So in the lockdown, they've developed something called Secret Sofa. So Secret Sofa is basically where once a week on a Friday, everybody gets together, watches a film at the same time, and through the week you get clues as to what the movie is, and they give you a whole pack, which is what, you know, how you might want to dress up, music playlists. So it's the kind of secret cinema experience recut for an online audience. And it's sponsored by Haagen-Dazs, so, you know, it's got various different ways to monetize. It's like £10, but 1,000 people, you know, signed up to the first one, and it's because they're people that follow secret cinema, so we'll follow them wherever they go.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you. If you don't mind, maybe we'll ask one more quick question and then maybe finish off the rest of your slides. I know that a lot of people are kind of interested in seeing those last few, if you don't mind.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to carry on. I don't know if you've got to bring a stop to at any point. But...
We are kind of running out of time, but maybe, yeah, if we just do one more question and then get through those last slides, that might be great. So this question is from Peter, and I guess it kind of carries on from what you've been talking about, so we can just kind of quickly touch on it. But with so much content now available, how do we create more noise in this already very noisy landscape? And how can we be heard? How can our work cut through?
Yeah, so one thing is often we rely on, you know, our own website and, you know, or whatever it is to sort of share the message. And you know, what I really learned through Culture Label is go where the audience is. And, you know, it's much easier to go where people are already hanging out and then find a way to have a conversation with them than it is just a kind of broadcast. You know, the internet is brilliant because it's this two-way thing. You know, so I talked about, you know, Tilly and the Buttons earlier. It's just such a great example. So yes, she had her blog, but she was going on and using things like Pinterest and Instagram because she realized that the beauty of what she did was very visual. So by sharing her designs, having conversations, she found it was those platforms that really, you know, grew her presence. And then she could take that audience onto her own website, where actually she could then sell them a whole range of things, you know, on the back of sort of going elsewhere to find that audience. So I think that's really important, is, you know, and think really hard about the customer journey, because the other bit about this is what do customers really need that they're not getting now? What gap are you filling that, you know, or how are you doing something better than somebody else is doing? Because there's a myriad of different audiences in the online space. But you really need to deeply understand the trends. Like the way an entrepreneur would look at this, and it's applying the same kind of techniques, is to go, okay, well, what are the consumer trends that are out there? What are the technology trends? Then what's unique about me, my ideas, my networks, my spaces, whatever it is that you've got? And how do I plug that into what audiences are doing anyway? Because you don't want to be going against the grain, against the curve. You know, you want to be sort of riding those trends and inserting what you do into those trends. And I think, you know, some of the best examples that I've talked about are where people are doing that. And then obviously what's great about this is, you know, it's not true that you can do this stuff for nothing. You know, it does require some resources, which might just be your time. It doesn't have to cost huge amounts of money. But, you know, one of the seminars that we have on the Remix Academy is all around like how you create great video content for free or for very little, because there are so many tools, software out there that actually cost very little now that give you like a really professional result. So you can start experimenting. And you can just get things out there. And obviously, because you get all this amazing data and analytics in the internet, you just refine from there and, you know, move on. If it's not working, try something else if it is, you know. But yeah, there's some inspirational examples out there of what people do. And the great thing about COVID-19 is we're all forced to do this stuff. So I think there'll be amazing new voices and people coming out of the cultural sector. And I'll bet you it often won't be the usual spokespeople that we put forward. Like so much about, if you're going to go on something like Twitch where the average age is 21, you know, you've got to find the right voice for something like that. They're not going to be interested in what I've got to say or how I do it, you know. You know, it's about finding the you know, and I talked about it with Emily at the Field Museum. You know, she was a secret weapon for that organisation.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'm really excited to see kind of what people come up with. All right. So yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, if maybe we can just carry on how with the last of your slides, would that be okay?
Yeah, no problem. And I've got as long as people need from my side, and I'll obviously make sure I share those slides with people afterwards.
Perfect.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Can you still see my slides on screen, Laura? Great, okay. So actually I mentioned Twitch, I'll go on to Twitch briefly, and this is really about sort of live streaming more generally. So there's an online to offline connection again. So 67% of people who watched a live stream said they went on to purchase a ticket to a similar type of live event. Now this is from Vimeo. They do live streaming, so you can take that with a pinch of salt. Direct monetization is really good on live streams. So 45% of people say they would pay for a live stream by a favorite performer, speaker, etc. Interestingly, and again, I say this comes from Vimeo, 87% would prefer to watch online if it meant they got more behind the scenes content. So obviously, you know, sometimes it's the assumption that everything we do should be physical in the cultural space, but obviously some audiences prefer to consume their content online, and there are things that you can do online that potentially you can never do online, or, you know, alongside an offline experience. And then the big part about that is, you know, millennials, you know, age 14 to 25 watch more online video than TV. So this is where they're hanging out anyway. So I've mentioned Twitch because Twitch is not the biggest video platform, but it's in the live streaming space. It's the one to kind of watch for creators. And you probably know Twitch because primarily people use this to watch games. Odd concept, I know, but it's hugely popular. But really, it's more about the engaged reaction with the people that are streaming and playing those games. So think about your superfans again. And also, Twitch is changing because it's getting bigger. People are using it for other stuff. So in December 2019, Twitch viewers watched 81 million hours of something called Just Chatting. So this is the kind of conversation live streaming part of Twitch. So this was more people than watched their #1 game on Twitch, League of Legends, or things like Fortnite. And non-gaming streaming activities predicted to be their #2 category in 2020. So a lot of comedians and musicians are now starting to use Twitch as a platform for their live streaming. And part of the reason is it's set up for live streaming, that was its origins, but also there are less barriers to coming in and making money. So their threshold for doing stuff and where you can start to collect cash is less than something like YouTube. So you need still, you know, 500 total minutes broadcast in the last 30 days. You need 7 unique broadcast days in the last 30 days. You need to have an average of 3 concurrent viewers or more over the last 30 days, and you need 50 followers, but it's a bit less than what you would be asked for by YouTube. But their monetization tools are great. So they have a virtual currency called bits that can be changed into cash. So I can be doing a live stream now, and you can give me a cheers, and I will collect a micro transaction for that. You know, might only be a few cents, but the idea is that they add up. If somebody subscribes to my channel, I will collect 50% of that. Twitch get the other 50%. And they offer different types of subscription levels, from like $4.99 up to $25. So again, superfans might come in at $25, and that's worth a lot more to me. I can also monetize the ads. So again, I'll get a cut of ads for non-subscribers. And you can also use platforms like Streamlabs to sell merchandise and other things to those fans. So some of the things that we talked about on YouTube. And then YouTube's obviously big in this space as well. Their big monetization tools beyond the ones that I talked about on live streaming, something called Super Chat. So as you can see from the image on the slide there's somebody giving a live stream. And a bit like on Zoom, people can ask questions. And if you're a super fan, you might have a particular icon next to your name, an emoji or whatever, that I know that you're a super fan. So I might want to answer your question because I know you're a paying subscriber to my channel. Or you can do what's called super chat. So you can pay to have your chat or your question pinned to the top, you know, which might be a comment on what I'm saying or a question, whatever it is. And again, I know that that's a super chat one. So I go, well, I better answer that one because that person's paying again for my time and my attention. There are other live streaming platforms. Obviously, we're on Zoom today. Zoom, you can do simple things like put in a PayPal plugin that allows you to, you know, I could ask somebody for a donation. Obviously, we've talked about things like Facebook. Facebook's, you know, the biggest platform that people are consuming video alongside YouTube. it's in there because obviously, you know, you can ping things like donations next to it, but it's slightly less about monetizing that video compared to something, or that live stream compared to something like Twitch or YouTube. But obviously it's a popular way that people consume video. Then if you want real control over your live stream, where maybe you want it to appear within your website rather than having all the YouTube stuff around it, something like Vimeo is a really good option for that. So Vimeo will host your live stream, but you control everything that appears around that video. Then obviously there are other platforms. There are many of them that do live streaming that are very popular along the bottom. Things like Twitter does it, Instagram does it through its stories feature, like 250 million people on that. There's now LinkedIn Live, even things like, you know, Skype or Microsoft Teams or House Party, as you know, lots of us are now doing in lockdown, but they're slightly less focused on monetization. So I've not really sort of focused on them as much. Then there's e-learning, again, massive growth area. So $250 billion industry, people reckon, by 2025, growing at nearly 10% a year. 4 quick examples, platforms that I would say are interesting here. One is Masterclass. Now, as you can see from the examples that I'm showing on screen, this is things, you know, it's very celebrity driven. So Martin Scorsese teaches filmmaking, or Hans Zimmer teaches, you know, film scoring. I think this is quite an interesting model. They want to be the sort of Netflix of the e-learning industry. It's because, and you've probably seen their ads on Facebook, it's received a lot of funding. So one of the things that .coms do, which is a great business model, is they get funding so they can operate for a period of time to build an audience without making a lot of money, because they've got funding in the bank to do that. That's hard for cultural institutions, but creative businesses or social enterprises can do that now, so it's changing. You know, if you've got an idea, you can get somebody to invest some money in that idea, which means you can start the idea off, maybe hire some people, pay for some marketing, get the right skills, you know, without having immediately sort of made any money. And Masterclass is a good example of this. And the reason I mention it is 80% of their participants, this is their first experience of online learning. So they've done an amazing thing in that they're basically getting this stuff out to people that are trying online learning for the first time, because it's so celebrity driven, to the point that their subjects are as diverse. It's not all creative like I've got there. It's, you know, tennis tips from Serena Williams, cooking advice from Gordon Ramsay, or vocal training from Christina Aguilera. I look at this as like the modern version. I remember my dad, you know, he's into golf, so he had like Nick Faldo teaches golf VHS video. This is like the modern version of that. Their business model is really interesting. They do pay those celebrities a little bit to make the video, but it's all about the profit share. So they get 30% of anything that's made. So that's a great thing about the internet. If you've got a great idea, you could say to somebody, well, give me your time to record some e-learning, and I will give you a share of the profit that we make. Another great example, which is a really big player, is Udemy. So Udemy have 150,000 courses. So a lot of competition, but it's used by millions of people. And as a creative, you can create a course. And so, you know, if you think you can teach somebody something, you know, to do with your creative practice, you produce a series of videos. They work best if they're interactive and there's other learning materials around them. But Udemy democratizes learning. Anybody can go on there and put a course on there. And obviously you then try and sell it to your networks, but also there's audiences on Udemy that will find you as well. And you will get 50% of the revenue for the course that you sell to anybody. But if you sell that course directly, say through your own website or to your social following, and you generate the customer, you get 97% of the revenue. So it's actually a really good platform to host your learning materials. But Udemy's pretty broad. You know, there's teaching about everything. Whereas Skillshare, the good side is it's much more creative focused. So you'll see some examples there that I'm looking at on screen around, you know, craft or painting. People that have, you know, 20, 30,000 students that have used or, you know, followed their courses. So big numbers. So Skillshare, for example, has 578,000 followers in the fine arts section, nearly 800,000 in the music section, 1 million in the creative writing section. So big numbers of people that are going on there to use these courses. But the monetization for the creative is not quite as good. So their model is not a pay-per course, it's a subscription. And if your course is viewed by a paying subscriber, you will get a percentage of your views basically from Skillshare. So they say that new teachers, if you upload a course, might be earning $300 a month. So certainly not going to be, you know, your day job. More popular established teachers, the likes of which you can sort of see on the slide, can earn up to $5,000. And then the final example, and this one I wanted to give, is around the kind of cultural sector more specifically. You know, my 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, they're now watching jams for juniors online through the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. You know, it's through YouTube. It's really nicely done as an interactive experience for kids. And it's entirely free, but it's paid for by a sponsor. So the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra offer it for free, but it's supported by Emirates. But again, they do really great online learning because there's a kind of colouring book around it. We made a shaker the other day to do our accompaniments to Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker. So they show you how to build like DIY instruments. So it's not that kind of passive just watching something, and that's the trick to online learning. Last 2 slides now, I promise. The final couple of trends. One is personalisation. I think this is tailor-made for arts and culture. So this is about, again, sort of our super fans, and no matter how big your following, it's can you produce something very tailored and personal online in response to what your audience want. So I thought a really good example of this was the singer Tanya Batts, or Bat. So she just reached out to her 5,000 Facebook followers and said, right, name a cover of your choice. I will record that cover for a pay what you can fee. But you know, she could have done anything for those followers, but it was about just going out to people and saying, well, what do you want? Laura's looking at me now saying, I think we've reached the end of the road. So look, I had another slide to go, but you know, you can go and watch it on the Academy anyway in your own time over a cup of Horlicks or whatever.
Thanks so much, Peter, and so much great content. I wish we had longer, but we've already gone over time, so it's probably time to wrap it up for today. I just want to acknowledge all of those questions that have come through, and I'm sorry that we didn't get the opportunity to answer all of them with you today. We will try and get to those after the session. And I want to say thanks so much, Peter. Gosh, that was such a really useful and practical session that I think so many people will be able to apply, especially during these kind of wild times. So thank you so much for your time putting that together. And thank you everybody for joining us. What a great session to end the week. We will be publishing the recording on our website, so stay tuned for that if you couldn't make it all the way through. Next week, we have 3 webinars. We've got 2 on Wednesday and then 1 on Friday. And we've got Penny Miles from Circus Oz and Dr. Amanda Tattersall both on Wednesday, and the Google Creative Lab on Friday. And if you haven't already registered, you can do this on our website. And that's it, I think. If you've got any questions, queries, concerns, you can send us an email at leadershipprogram@australiacouncil.gov.au. But otherwise, have a lovely weekend, everybody, and thanks so much, Peter.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for bringing us together, Laura.
Pleasure.